This is the second part of Daniel chapter 4, and I want to read from the end of Daniel chapter 4, from verse 33. Immediately, what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from people and ate grass like cattle. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle and his nails like the claws of a bird. At the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes towards heaven, and my sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High. I honoured and glorified him who lives forever. His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" At the same time that my sanity was restored, my honour and splendour were returned to me for the glory of my kingdom. My advisers and nobles sought me out, and I was restored to my throne and became even greater than before. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right, and all his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble. Nebuchadnezzar went through a huge life change on these two occasions. One was this great humbling, and the second was his great restoration. And there are situations and times perhaps in life, markers that we have, maybe moments that it feels that the whole of our life, our career, or our existence, or our mental health have crumbled. And that can be a great falling, a great disaster, a great crash. And yet there are times when we might experience a great restoration as well. And God is the God of restorations. Look how far Nebuchadnezzar fell, how sort of total that crash was, how public, how humiliating, how difficult, how much that must have been talked about, and how dreadful to be wandering around, having been king of that whole empire, and people see this kind of creature there on the grass somewhere, and what is that? Oh, it's a person. Oh, that's Nebuchadnezzar. Oh, that's the great king. I can't quite imagine what that must have been like for him. And the sad kind of conversations that would have happened. Yeah, the king. What a disaster. What a terrible, awful story. You know, he's never going to get better, is he? There's no way out for him. And we might have written people off as well. We might write ourselves off. We might say that's such a disaster. That's such a tragedy. What a waste of a life. I pray today that wherever we feel that for ourselves, whether we feel that for somebody that we know, whether we see somebody who's homeless or you know, in a terrible state, we think they're beyond the pale, there's no chance for them. I pray that God would help us, give us fresh eyes of compassion. Those people who perhaps we would easily despise, those people that we would see as dishevelled and broken and smelly, disgusting, crazy, whatever, those people that we perhaps would really struggle to see any redemptive hope for. May God give us his eyes for them. May we see them through his eyes. May we have a vision of what God's restoration can look like. And I pray for that gift of faith for us, that faith that we need to perhaps believe that this is possible. People who might be in the darkest place. And I certainly know people who've been in a very, very dark place, who've been really crazy addicts who've been in a terrible mess, people who've gone through severe mental health problems, all sorts of situations like that. And yet I know them today, and it's hard to imagine what they once were. It's hard to picture in my mind, thinking what that person was like 10, 20 years ago, and how different they must be now to what they were then. And maybe some of us have had that experience in our own lives as well. But I pray for that. I pray for if you're watching this and you don't have any relationship with God, maybe your life isn't as wonderful as you'd like it to be. Maybe you've got to the point of feeling in a deep crisis. Maybe you're someone who, you have quite deep hidden issues, or they might be blatantly obvious to everybody around you. And they're pretty obvious to yourself, really, if you are honest about it. But God is a God of restoration. So I pray for that. Just look up and say, Lord God, I need your help. I need you. I need you to restore me. I need you to help me. I feel like I've got myself in the right pit. And I need a transformation. I need change. The power of God can do that. And maybe there are things that feel like a bit of a pit at the moment, and they might not be so life-changing. They might be relatively small things, but they've got us into such a dark place in our thinking. They've got us into a dark place in our life. Our minds are full of anxiety or worry. Things that actually may be quite out of proportion. I mean, they're not life-changing, but they've become all-consuming. They're pits of despair or anxiety or worry. They're pits of hopelessness. They're pits of frustration. They're pits of bitterness, or pits of other things that have just got us stuck. And we want to be free. We want to move forward, but our eyes are really on the problem. There's an Oscar Wilde phrase: two looked out of prison bars, one saw mud, the other stars. At the moment, what can you see? And there's a sense which we're not just looking at the stars, we're not just looking at some vague hope, but we're looking up and saying, God, help me. I need your help. I've got a friend who was very suicidal at one point, and he was really considering suicide. And he went out into the garden, from what I remember his story is, and he went up and he just looked up, and he didn't know God, and he said, God, if you're there, help me. And that was his turning point. A lovely, lovely guy. Now he's sometime later he's married. He's got a real passion for people who are struggling, and he's one of the most encouraging people I've ever met. So lovely, his messages and encouragements. Really incredibly loving person. And his life was turned around in just that moment when he called on God, and he didn't have an experience of God, but he called on him. And I just feel like today is a day that we can take that opportunity. Wherever you're at right now, whatever, you might be a Christian, you might not be, but call on God, ask for his help, ask for his intervention, ask for that encounter, like Nebuchadnezzar, this king, way back in this ancient world, having lost everything of his empire, having lost all his grandeur and splendor and power, and his pride was totally fallen. He became such a disgusting mess, really. And yet, God was able to restore him. So whatever your self-care seems like today, whatever your state of mind seems like today, whatever the state of your house, whatever the state of your clothes, whatever the state of your finances, whatever the state of your circumstances around you, the relationships, God is so keen to restore and redeem and put things back in his order. Your old order may not be restored in the same way, but his new order, his kingdom can come. Just lastly, I'm just quickly going to mention, there's a lovely story in Genesis. Genesis 37 begins how Joseph, the son of Jacob, was given this amazing robe. This, you probably know the musical Joseph and his Technicolor Dreamcoat, an amazing robe. And his father gave it. He was a very favourite of the family, and of course this caused jealousies with his brothers. And the jealousy ended up with they wanted to get rid of him. They put him into a pit, and thankfully one of his brothers thought it was better if he was sold on to some travelling salesman than actually being left in a pit to die. Anyway, this robe was taken back to the father. They tore it, they put some goat's blood on it, and they said, oh look, you know, your son has just been torn to shreds by some wild beast. His life is over. You know, and this Jacob, the father, for 22 years mourned, believing his son had been lost and killed. And yet, this son ended up in prison and ended up in an official's house, and for a while was in prison, but then began to be restored and ended up as effectively the prime minister in Egypt. And it was not till much later that the father found that his son had been restored. He hadn't died. So whatever's been torn apart, whatever has been devastated, don't lose hope, because maybe God's been working and restoring and doing a greater thing in your life. That whatever glory you might have had before, like this coat torn to shreds, God has a greater purpose than just the outside things. He has a desire to restore your identity. He has a desire to make you the person that he's called you to be. And you may, you know, you might get authority and accolades, you might get outward things, you might get an amazing career, all sorts of other things. But the inner identity that God wants to restore is the thing above everything, the really special thing. Because he's calling you to be a son and a daughter. He's calling you to find him and know him. And I pray that you would be restored to all that he wants. As you trust him, let him restore your identity. Let him restore your hope. Let him make you into a new person, like the butterfly, coming out of the cocoon, coming out of the chrysalis, being made into a new person. So I pray that for you. I pray that restoration process, wherever you're at right now, whatever your circumstances are right now, I pray for restoration.